Thank you, Kunal, for this generous introduction. Rajiv, not a very courageous person at all, and I haven't done very much. Anybody who knows the situation in the territories knows that there's a kind of infinite task, and we make very small inroads. But I do want to say that I'll be speaking about a topic which, although it's not directly related to that, has some relevance to it, because I want to be speaking about truth tonight and the idea of truth. Before I do that, I want to just say that I'm very honored and happy to be here as a guest of the CSDS, and everyone knows the very special place that this institution has in the life of Delhi and the life of India as a whole. I have many good friends here, including some old new friends, people who I've known through their books but have met for the first time here just 5 minutes ago. So I feel like I'm surrounded by friends, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for bringing me here. Okay, I'm going to be speaking about truth. And perhaps this may seem to you a somewhat unusual topic, because I think in the ways that we talk about truth today, especially in English or in any European language for that matter, or think about it in any European language, I think we tend to think about truth as a kind of external thing, which has a sort of representational aspect in the language that we use to speak about it. Can you all hear me okay? Is that okay? That is to say, I think we tend to think that truth is some kind of universal abstraction, and that it is something out there. It's out there in the world, and we can somehow grasp it or discover it and then articulate it in language. That's a representationalist view of what truth is, and a kind of objectivist view. Truth is something which can be discovered or revealed and articulated. Whereas I'm going to be saying something which perhaps initially may not strike you as so earth-shaking. I hope to be able to flesh it out over the course of the evening. To me, I think the traditional Indian, pre-modern Indian notion of truth, carrying over in many ways to the modern, is that truth is not something that pre-exists in the world, but something that one makes, especially makes out of the stuff of one's own self. And incidentally, it's not usually something that one knows. The epistemic quality of truth is in many ways its least significant aspect. Truth is something that is made and that is. And the relation that this truth or truthfulness has with the language which expresses it is an intrinsic one, not an external one. That is, this language somehow embodies truth, and always, or nearly always, in a non-symbolic and non-representational way. Actually, the minute one begins to think about this, it becomes clear right away that, after all, truth is something which is culturally inflected, culturally, contextually determined. For example, if we think about truth in Greek, truth is aletheia in Greek. Aletheia, the word comes from the root lantano, or lantanomai, which means to forget, or actually not to pay attention. So actually truth is a non-aletheia, a non-inattention, a failure, that is to say, it's a failure to pay attention, right? And if one pays attention, then you can achieve truth, or you can perhaps unveil the truth. And many of you will know that Heidegger famously made an entire kind of theology of truth out of this observation. I don't know about you, but I live in the Mediterranean world. This whole way of thinking about truth, the Greek truth, seems to me to be completely impregnated with the particular light and sounds and air of the Mediterranean. It's a Mediterranean kind of vision of truth. Very different, I think, from what we might find in India. Okay? So I'm going to be talking about the Tamil Ramayana, the Kamban Ramayana, but before we get to that, I want to say a few words, at least a few sentences, about the idea of truth or truthfulness, satya, in Sanskrit, because we all have a kind of common ground. So I'll tell you a story from Sanskrit class. Lots of interesting things happen in Sanskrit class. So just about a week ago, I was reading with my advanced Sanskrit students. We were reading Mrityakartikam. That is the little clay cart of Shudraka, famous 5th century play. Most of you will know it well. So there, there's this hero Charudatta. And Charudatta was once a wealthy man, but because of his tremendous generosity, he's lost all of his riches. And he's in love with the very beautiful courtesan Vasantasena. And she, I don't want to explain the circumstances, she's given him a box of jewels and gold to keep as a kind of trust, just to hold it in trust for her, okay? But in the third act of this play, a very rather delightful and erudite thief called Sharvilaka actually breaks into the compound of Charudatta at night, and he makes off with this box, okay? So then, when they discover the theft, everybody with me so far? When they discover the theft, so Charudatta is, of course, immensely appalled. This thing has been given to him as a trust, and he's lost it, right? His friend is there, the Vidushaka Maitreya. So the Vidushaka says, he says, what's the problem? There was no box, there was no thief, and there was no witness, he said. That's very typical of the Vidushaka, right? That's the way he would think about it. But Charudatta, of course, cannot go like that. He's a person of great honor, So fortunately, Charudatta's wife, he's married to a woman, she has a Ratnavali, that is a pearl necklace, which is of immense value. And she brings this pearl necklace and gives it to Charudatta and says, you can give this to Vasantasena in lieu of the box that was stolen, okay? So Charudatta is immensely relieved, and he says a very simple, kind of beautiful verse. He says, I'm a poor man, but in some ways I'm a very rich man, he says. Why is that? Because he says, Vibhabhanugata bharya, I have a wife who is suitable to my temperament. Sukha dukkha suhrid bhavan, and you, my friend, he's speaking to Maitreya, the Vidushaka, you're my friend in good times and bad times. Satyam cha naparibrashtam, and my satya, my truth, we always translate it as truth, my truthfulness has not been ruined. Satyam channa paribrashtam, yad daridreshu durlabham. And that's something that's very rare among poor people, he says, right? And then he says to the Vidushaka, he says, take this necklace, this very valuable necklace, please, and give it to Vasantasena in my name, and tell her the following. Tell her, I made a mistake. I mistakenly thought that this box that I had was my own box, and I lost it in a game of dice. So please accept this Ratnavali instead of the box, right? That's what he says. So we're reading this thing. My student says, one of the students, he says, wait a minute. Here at Charudatta, he's sending his friend to tell an outright lie. Of course, maybe it's a kind of white lie, but still it's a lie to Vasantasena. And the first thing he's just said, Satyam chana paribrashtam. My truthfulness is completely intact. How can you explain that? So you see what I mean? I said to him, actually, Satya is not really very much about telling the truth. It's not about telling truth. It's a different kind of notion. I'm not talking about all the possible usages of the word Satya, but I am talking about a prevalent usage, which is not foreign to us after all. We also know it from Gandhiji, who, when he says Satya and Satyagraha, he also means something rather different from simply telling the truth, right? It's something that one might actually want to translate in a different way. You could use a modern term and say it's something like integrity, or character, or authenticity, or these are modern terms, but something like that. Truth may actually be the wrong translation for Satya. Okay. However, I hasten to say that there are classical contexts in which Satya does actually mean something like knowing the truth or telling the truth. For example, in the Chandogya Upanishad, the famous passage, Chandogya 6:16, where Uddalaka Aruni is teaching Shwetaketu, his son, the truth about the Atman and the world. At the end of it, he gives a very beautiful example. He's given all these famous images of the banyan seed and the salt in the water and all of that. In the end, he says, you know what it's like, this thing that I'm trying to convey to you, this Satya that I'm trying to convey to you. He says it's like the case of a man who's accused of theft, and he has to submit to an ordeal. The ordeal is he has to grasp in his hand an axe that has been heated in the flames. So, if he's truly innocent, he can hold the axe. And in that sense, he is, the Upanishad said, this is Uddalaka Aruni, he's He's satyabhisandha, that is to say, he speaks the truth, although incidentally he hasn't said anything. It's interesting that he's actually silent in that moment. And then he says, satyam atmanam kurute. He makes himself into truth, okay? So there already, you can see there's a slightly different perspective on this notion of satya, right? Here there's also a linguistic element. He speaks the truth, although again, I want to say he hasn't said anything, actually, but he's speaking the truth, right? So there's some kind of content, and this also reflects upon the knowledge, this particular kind of special knowledge that the father has been trying to teach his son. But I want you to again notice the way the text tells us this, you know? Satyam atmanam kurute. He makes himself into this truth. So as I said earlier, truth is something that one makes in pre-modern India. Okay? One makes out of the stuff of oneself. Now, I think, actually, I probably haven't said anything so far which is very earth-shaking. I think probably all of you know this. Actually, it's maybe almost a trivial observation, but actually there is something more to be said about this, and here's where the Tamil Ramayana can perhaps be of some use to us, okay? So we're now going to shift into the Kaveri Delta. I'll just give you perhaps 2 sentences about the Kamban Ramayana so that you know what the text is that I'm talking about. Some of you know it well. I'll be reading to you 3 or 4 short passages from the Ayodhyakandam. What can I tell you? Kamban Ramayana, we think it was composed perhaps in the 12th century, at the height of the Chora period. It's very much rooted in that world of the Kaveri Delta. The poet Kamban is supposed to have belonged to a beautiful village called Tirundur. He was patronized by a man called Sarayappan of a village called Tiruvenninallur. That's about all we know, actually. But the important thing, this really you have to know, is that here's a book which is felt by Tamil speakers to somehow encapsulate the entire civilization of this South Indian moment at its peak. A lot of scholars, sorry to say, including myself, have wasted a lot of time kind of documenting all kinds of narrative digressions or distinctions that the Kamban text makes relative to the Valmiki original. They're perhaps not completely uninteresting, but they're not very important, because the main thing is that Kamban Ramayana inhabits a different mental, moral universe. That's the main thing, and you'll hear it tonight. You'll hear it in the passage that I'm going to read. I should say that my feeling is that the Ayodhyakandam in the Kamban Ramayana is about this question of truth. That's the theme that comes again and again and again. Again, of course, he's taken it in a certain sense from his model in the Valmiki Ramayana, where again that theme is present. But Kamban takes it in a new direction, and he also shows us, let's call it the non-trivial linguistic aspect of truth. And I want to try to introduce you to this and say a few things about it. I have a sort of explanation of what's going on here, which I'll save for the end, okay? So I'll begin with a passage. This is from a long chapter called the Nagar Ningu Parlam, that is to say the chapter about leaving the city of Ayodhya, because this is the moment when Rama, first of all, meets his father, Dasharatha. The whole thing develops, as we know. Eventually he leaves the city. The whole city comes with him into the forest. A very long, beautiful narrative essay. And I'm going to read a short passage to you, first of all, just to get you into the mood, but then I'm going to concentrate on 1 or 2 verses in which this notion of truth or truthfulness is very much in the foreground, okay? Perhaps I should say in advance that Tamil has 3 main words for truth, especially this kind of Tamil. There's the everyday word unmai. Unmai is truth, but actually it comes from the old root ul, ulku, undu. All Dravidian languages have this root, which really means something like to exist, to be in existence, and especially to be in some kind of interior existence. One could actually even translate the word unmai as something like interiority. It's a livingness inside, okay? So that's the usual word. Then there's a very common word, which you'll hear several times tonight, may. The interesting thing about may, there are actually two ancient Dravidian roots have conflated in this term may, but we're going to put that aside because actually nobody is supposed to know that. May means truth, but may also means the body. Okay, and this kind of homonymy is very central, as you'll hear in just a moment, to this notion of may. It's a different kind of way of talking about truth. Okay? Truth somehow related to the body. And finally, there's the word vaimai, or vaimori, which is actually a very important word in Tamil. Vai is the mouth, so vaimai is what comes out of the mouth. And here you can see one very central feature of all Tamil notions of truth, namely, we are talking only about spoken, oral, audible truth. Nobody would think of applying this term to something that is written down. Okay? It's an oral, living, audible sound. That's a very critical thing. I'll explain it to you maybe as we go along, because actually that's the kind of truth that I'm interested in here. Okay? So now let me read you a short passage. I'll set the scene for it. What's happened is that Dasharatha has gone to see Kaikeyi, and she's told him what she wants, and she's reminded him of the two boons that he has given her, right? And he has no choice, really, so he accepts the fact that Rama is not going to be crowned king, Bharata will be crowned, and that Rama is going to go into the forest for 14 years, right? And he's fallen in a faint on the ground. And meanwhile, the sage Vasishta arrives, and he takes in this whole situation, and Kaikeyi actually tells him what has happened, right? So I'm going to read you a few verses. We're moving towards a verse that is of particular interest to me, okay? She spoke, she is Kaikeyi, she spoke, and even before she had finished, with hands gentle as the lotus, he raised up the King of Kings from the dust where he lay. He is Vasishta. Learned Lord, he said, entreating him, grieve no more. This woman will grant the kingdom to the one you love. What is this you are doing? Stop it now. He sprinkled him with cool water and fanned him a little with the royal fan, coaxing him until awareness returned. As the venom in the words of the woman who was poisoned in spate abated slightly, the king spoke the name of the son he loved and breathed again. Notice that breathing, please. Vasishta saw it and said, Master, put aside this great sorrow. The prince will rule this land in the pride of manhood. What obstacle can intervene? She who spoke those inglorious words will herself give him the crown. If this one, black as a rain cloud, that is Rama, were to refuse it and go away, would we go on living? Suffer no more. I might mention to you that Vasishta in this whole passage in Kamban, he's a kind of Delhi intellectual. That is, he's into sort of, rationalizing, making sense of this whole thing. He believes that there must be a way out of this. We'll just sort of maybe reinterpret the, there must be some, he says, how can we go on living without Rama? This is absurd. We'll find someone. We'll find a solution. He's a Tam Brown intellectual, and, there must be a way out of this. And he's rational. He tries one way after another again and again. Usually he's talking about what you might call raison d'etat. These are political considerations of a high order, for the good of everybody. He has his ways of thinking about it. And they all sound quite pathetic, actually, So the king, he needs to hear this. He looked at the sage. Master, he said, before I die, heavy with unthinkable deeds, make him wear the great crown. Make him stop thinking of the wilderness and save me from the shame that rests in my words. Yen urayum kundrum pari punamal kavai kove, he says, don't save me from this shamefulness that is in my words. Listen to the language, the emphasis on speech, okay. The sage looked straight at the fierce woman who had done the hateful deed, Kaikeyi. Now, he said, Golden Lady, won't you give back the kingdom to your son, who is the breath of life to all of us, above all to your husband, who holds fast to Manu's way, and thus win a good and holy name, free from blame. See, he thinks, Vasishta, completely wrongly, that actually Kaikeyi can just retract the whole thing. She can take it back. It's not at all possible in that moral universe, but that's what he's offering, you know. Now, here's the verse I want you to pay some attention to. He spoke, Vasishta, he spoke, who had cut off karma at the root, and she wept, gasping for breath, as she said, "If the king swerves from truth, I will have no desire to live on in this world. To ensure that my word does not turn to a lie, I will die." I'm going to recite it in Tamil because there are people in the audience who know the Tamil, okay? So, Moeman vinai vera ravendruyarvan moriamunnam, vimma aruval arasan meil tirivanyanin, imma ulhat tuirodini varvu haven yensol poemana martindre pondradorien yendral. So this is Kaikeyi speaking. So what does she say? I want you to pay attention. I'll read the verse again. Her words. First off, she's weeping, gasping for breath. Right? Actually, you know, it's interesting. She just got what she wanted, right? So you might think she'd be reasonably okay with all of this, but no, she's sobbing. Why is that? Why is she sobbing? Well, actually, she knows two things. First of all, she knows that basically she's killed her husband. I mean, she can see, you know. So that's bad enough, but she also knows that he's spoken in a certain way, and she has also spoken. That's what she says. If the king swerves from truth, I will have no desire to live on in this world. To ensure that my word does not turn to a lie, I will die. So there are two words, right? And the interesting thing is that in her mind, and I guess she's right about this, these two words that have been sort of released into the world, it's like a zero-sum game. Only one person of these two is going to be able to survive. And in a way, the point is, you see, that these words, once they have indeed been released into the world, these are particular words. These are words that have a kind of intensity about them, right? It's not just ordinary speech. The truth is that even ordinary speech, actually the same rules apply. But we'll put aside that for the moment. I'll come back to that if you like later. But certainly in a kind of heightened, intensified speech like this, you know. So once you've said it, and again I say it's an oral thing, once you've uttered these words, then it's as if you've sort of set off a kind of missile or a satellite or something like that that is programmed to go to the end. You can't recall it. I mean, you can swerve away from it. That's what she says, right? If he wanders away from this truth, Dasharatha, right, then, you know, then she's going to have to die in order to preserve the truthfulness of her words. That's what she says. So there's a danger that the person who made the initial statement can swerve away from it. Actually, it'd be better to speak of slipping away. That's the language. Tavaradal, slipping away. You can. That's a real danger. You speak a certain way. The words are already out there doing their thing. They're like programmed to go to the end. There's no way you're going to be able to change that. But it is possible for the person who spoke them to slip away from it. So that's a real danger. And I'll say a bit more about why that's such a danger in a minute. Now, there's another thing that I have to say here. This is just our first kind of foray into the question of truth in the Ayodhyakandam. See, Kaikeyi here very correctly draws a connection between being alive, between living and this truth. That's a deep, inherent connection. It's an intrinsic link in Tamil. She uses the word vuyar. Vuyar is the prana, the breath of life. So she says, you know, what's the danger? She says, if he goes back, if he wanders away from the truth, then I won't be able to go on with my vuyar. There's a link between that breathing and living vuyar and the actual articulation of truth, right? It's a linguistic thing in a way. Actually, you know, in Tamil linguistics, the aksharas are divided into two. There's consonants, may, truth, may, body, right? And the vowels, vuyar. These are a pair, they go together. There's a deep, intrinsic, necessary link between these two. So, I mean, why is that? I'm going to give you another example in just a moment, but for one thing, see both of these two things, the breathing, this breath of life, and the truth, which is somewhere inside it, in a way, they both have a kind of rhythm to them. There's this rhythm of breathing in and breathing out. And by the way, that rhythm exists on all the levels of the world. That is, individually, each of us breathe in and breathe out, but our inhalation and expiration, exhalation, these activities also reflect a kind of breathing in and out of the world itself. The entire cosmos is doing this, and God himself, incidentally. And we're talking about God because Rama here is God, right? So there's, on all levels, there's this kind of rhythm, and truth has that rhythm. Actually, it's a kind of musical rhythm, because truth has a kind of beat to it. It's in language, right? So you can hear it. There's a sort of musical rhythm that is in Uyghur and in truth, okay? Now, there's another interesting thing. I don't have time to give you all the texts that would support this, but let me just say that there's a strong sense that may, truth or truthfulness, exists somewhere inside Uyghur. Uyghur is the universal principle of being alive. Somewhere inside it is this harmonic may. But on the other hand, may is also the body, right? That is, it's the body that contains, you could say, the Uyghur that comes in and out of it. So we have a really remarkable situation where actually both the breath of life, life itself, Uyghur, and may, they're simultaneously both inside and outside of one another. It's almost like a kind of Dissessurian paradox, right? Of the sign and its sound and the meaning, or you could think of it as a Möbius strip, which that twist in it that makes it impossible for you to know which side is up, right? It's something like that. That's important. We'll come back to that in a second. By the way, I just want to say again, the kind of may that we're talking about is a non-representational, non-symbolic kind of language. In fact, I'd be prepared to argue, you may not agree with me, maybe nobody in this room will agree with you, but I think actually symbolism as such doesn't exist in India. There is no such thing. There's no such semiotic operation, and representational symbolism in particular doesn't seem to have any importance here. But anyway, let me try to flesh out this kind of theology of the spoken, truthful word, okay? And then we'll come back and see where it takes us. Okay, I'm going to read you another short passage. This is just maybe an hour later. What's happened is that Kausalya, the mother, has arrived. And she has also been briefed. She's like understood now what's happening. And she sees her husband is in a really desperate state. She sees Kaikeyi there, relentless, but also sobbing and weeping, right? And Vasishta is there too. So Vasishta speaks again. Here's Vasishta. Begins with Vasishta. I'm going to read you a few verses again just to sort of set the stage, but there's a particular verse that I'm interested in that Kausalya says. Okay, so we heard Kaikeyi. Next one is, I want you to pay attention to, is Kausalya. Vasishta says, it's your husband who will die. He's actually speaking to Kaikeyi. It's your husband who will die. The world will not accept it. Shame will triumph. It's a sin. And still you won't budge. You understand nothing. There's no more I can say except this. It isn't right. Heartless, cruel as you are, you pay no heed to the sorrow that is ending your husband's life. Like fire in a wound, like poison are your words. Are you a woman or some false ghoul? What do you, with your fierce mind, have to do with this land? You're the one who told the prince to go to the forest, even before the king uttered these words. Notice again the language. You told him to go. She said something, right? Now he's committed to going deep into the wild paths of the wasteland. You are fire, consuming both life and fame. Are there any more cruel than you? What have you done? The sage without blemish spoke, and the king, still very weak, looked at the woman with poison on her tongue and said, Wicked one, did you tell my life's breath to depart for the fierce forest? And has he already set out? And again, he asked her, did you say to him to do it? Have you said it? I know your heart. This is Dasharatha speaking. I know your heart, wicked as you are. For too many days have I swallowed the poison seeping from your luscious lips. And now you've eaten up my life. Uyghur again. At the root, when I took your hand long ago before the fire, it wasn't a queen that I married, but death in some new form, whom I sought out. You can see, by the way, that this discussion about truth and truthfulness, it always takes place on the edge of life and death. He is the eye by which I see. He is Rama, of course. I have no other. He is the future of this family. In crooked ways you plotted to send him to the wilderness. You will kill me. You're shameless and low. Why keep saying it? That string that you wear on your neck as your wedding badge will be the string tied to the wrist of your son. In other words, she, Kake, is going to be widowed, right? Because of what she's asked. And he went on like this, looking at the heartless woman. Then to the sages he said, I swear she's no longer my wife. I've cast her off. As for Bharata, who is to be king, I no longer see him as my son. He's not fit to perform my last rites. You know, at the time of the funeral, when Bharata comes back, this thing explodes in a way that is not attested in the Valmiki Ramayana. Because at that point, Vasishta says to Bharata, wants to light the pyre. He says, no, your father said, it's impossible. You can't do it. You're not allowed even to be here, he says to him. It's a terrible, terrible moment. Anyway, now, he says to Kausalya, he is Dasharatha, he who was blocked from seeing me before he left, did he also not see you? She had come to ease the grief she saw for their son, like an eye, she had come to ease the grief she saw for their son, like an eye to them was set to depart, but seeing her failing now, the king too was failing. Now listen carefully. She knew, Kausalya. It was all the doing of the other wife. The king granted her wishes, but his heart couldn't take it. She wanted to comfort him by saying he'll come back. But she hesitated at the thought that the king would break his word. And here's the critical verse. She said to him, suffering as he suffered, Great One, if you fail to hold fast to unerring truth, your greatness that no one can deny will turn to disgrace. If you're weakened by love that can't face separation from your son, the world won't approve. Talla nilaysan nimmai taruva vahai tan evin, illa nilaykod perumai kirivam yanalal ravoy, illa nilayse rambal mahanel, niliyin ulaham kola dandro yandral, kanavan kuraya kureval. So, I want to just say a few words about this verse. Okay, we heard Kake. Now here's Kausalya. Look at the situation. Kausalya, she's dying to say to him, look, he's going to come back. It'll be all right. Eventually he'll come back. She wants it, but then she can't bring herself to do it. Why is that? Because of that word that had been uttered, right? She can't bring herself to do it. She uses the language of ancient Tamil heroic poetry, Sangam period poetry, which is the language of, it's called puhar, that is, say, fame, hero's fame, what the Greeks called kleos, and the opposite of puhar, which is normally pari, a kind of terrible, scandalous opprobrium. Here she calls it irive, something very low. Your puhar, this fame that you've won and held on to your whole life, you're going to lose that, and instead there's going to be irive, some very low down, shameful kind of thing. And that's the language she chooses. She says an interesting thing here. She says truth. She calls it unerring truth. Talla nilai san mimmai. That's truth whose state, nilai, cannot be jiggled away or shoved away or pushed away. Talla nilai. So, why is that actually? Now let's try and ask ourselves, we can ask the question from a slightly deeper perspective. It's the same question that we're dealing with before, but I think now we've added a little more information. Why is it that truth cannot jiggle, cannot be somehow impaired without immense existential cost? Why is it, So, there are different answers to this question. One answer is that the spoken word, especially the heightened, intensified spoken word, it's a fact. It may not exactly be an object, but actually it's pretty close to an object, because in Tamil, like in Sanskrit, actually things are basically words, right? In Sanskrit, the word for an object is padartha, the meaning of a word, an object. So actually in Tamil, I don't want to go into the whole kind of philosophy of this thing, but in Tamil too, the world is really made up of words, of sounds and words, what we might call word facts. That's the stuff of reality. That's what reality is all about. That sense of word like this is very much like other objects, like, say, a dream, which can be shared between various people because it too has a kind of objectified status. By the way, this is important because it means that in Tamil poetics and aesthetics, the aesthetic world of medieval Tamil, the basis of the theory, unlike Sanskrit aesthetics, generally, and it's a big generalization, it's a kind of objectivist poetics. It's about words and their effects in the world. Actually, I want to say something about the pragmatics of this kind of language that we're talking about, the pragmatics of truth. Really, tonight, I only have two things to tell you. One has something to do with the pragmatics of this speech thing, telling the truth, speaking truth, being truth, making truth. And the other is what you might call the architectonics of it, the sort of inner force of, forces that are at work in it. So let's look at the pragmatics for a second. You see, there are several kinds of heightened speech acts or speech forms. And we can differentiate the kind that we're dealing with here, the kind that Kaikeyi and Kaushalya have been talking about, from certain others. For example, there's mantra. Mantra is a heightened, intensified form of speech. But actually, this is nothing like mantra, not at all, right? This is something utterly different. Mantra actually is something which is not made. It cannot be made. It can only be heard. Whereas this kind of truth is made. And it's made in a kind of personal way, so it's not mantra. So what about curses and blessings? Shapa. Shapa, you might think this would be something like shapa. Everybody knows if a sage utters a shapa, so it's going to have to come true, right? There's no way out of it. It's going to have to happen. Curse or blessing, either way. Or an oath also. Shapa can also be an oath. But this isn't like that. Because, shapa, just think about it, from all the examples which I'm sure you can call up in your own minds, shapas are very eminently amenable to being qualified. Actually, it normally happens. Usually the sage says something in a moment of fierce rage or something like that. And then somebody, let's say like Ahalya, who says, what do you mean, I have to be a rock for all eternity? And she says, oh, no. Actually, there's the small print at the end of this contract we've just entered in. And if you read in the fine letters, it says that someday Rama will come and step on the rock, then you'll become a woman again, right? It's always like that. Blessings, too, by the way, are like that. Same thing. So, you see, but that doesn't apply to the kind of truthful speech that we're talking about here at all. You cannot take it back. That's what I said to you earlier, right? Vasishta says, well, to Kaikeyi, well, just take it back, retract it, but she can't do it. She herself knows she can't do it. And Kausalya won't even say these kind of comforting words because she doesn't want to even sort of approach that kind of territory where you might be able to. She knows you cannot take it back. So it's not like a shapa, right? It's something quite different. So what is it like? The closest thing is a kind of poetic speech. Poets speak like this. So I don't have time to develop this theme here, but let me just say that in South India generally, and certainly in the Tamil country, the poet says the word of the poet is something somehow analogous to this. It's not quite the same thing, for reasons that I'll explain in a minute, but it's kind of close. These are intensified, heightened speech acts. Okay, so now, look, what have we learned? We've learned, well, I've said a few things. One of the things perhaps I should repeat here, this truthful statement, this is something which comes out of the interiority of the person. There's an intrinsic relation to the innerness of that person. You could say it's an objective force released into the world, but charged with a certain kind of interiority. I'll tell you what kind, I promise you, in just 5 or 10 minutes, okay? How am I doing on time? Okay?
You're more than that.
Okay, great. So, okay, now let's step back for a second and ask ourselves, why is it that this kind of heightened speech is felt to be so effective in reality? Why is it that words like this, living in the world, change the world? Again, I want to say probably all language does that all the time, but here we have a special case in which there's no question that these words, so why is it? How is it that these kind of words actually work the way they do? And I have to say, I'm sorry, I can't give you a kind of full answer to this question. I think it's a good question, though. I'm going to mention something first But then I'm going to go on to something in the direction, a particular line of thought, which I hope will be of interest to you. Okay, but if my first something of a slightly theoretical and technical nature, if my colleague from Jerusalem, Don Handelman, is a famous anthropologist, if he were here tonight, I think what he would say is he would say that these words, this word package, this combination of sounds and syllables and all of that, he would say that it's a kind of model. He uses the language of modeling. Modeling is a non-symbolic activity for Handelman. A model means that you somehow condense or compress into a sort of tiny microcosm all the elements and forces and fields of force that are existing in some other domain, let us say the outside world, And it's done in such a way that because these are the same forces, the same elements, a change applied to the model will also apply to the external other domain, let us say the world. That's a common ritual mode. For example, the Agni Chayana, the Vedic sacrificial altar, is definitely something like that. It's a kind of model, okay? If Handelman were here, he would also probably say, you need another element. You also need a kind of recursive element. You have to have this model has to somehow twist inward on itself and go through itself. And that's true in a way about language too. Language, especially this kind of language, it has that recursive and reflexive quality about it. It's another reason why we might want to go in this way. I'm not going to go on with this more than another 30 seconds, but let me just say there's another reason that this might be an appealing explanation of how it works, and that is the fact that language, speech like this, vai mori, like the world, has a temporality built into it. The world, we know, has time, maybe different kinds of time. Language has both sequence, which unrolls in time, and it also has tense. See, I just said something which isn't entirely true, because in fact in Dravidian languages, South Indian languages, there is a kind of formal tense, but actually they have what linguists would call aspect, and tenses, I'm not so sure we actually even have tense in Dravidian. Aspect means the question of whether a process is completed or not completed. It doesn't really matter. What I want to say is that, you see, once you've uttered a word like this, the temporal aspect kicks in. The future, a kind of futureness, is built into the statement. So actually you have a kind of odd situation in which the future, which has already been articulated so that it already exists in some potential sense, that future is like moving towards you, even as the words that were uttered have moved backwards into the past, right? It's a sort of odd situation. But, there's something to that, because the futureness of the speech is a real part of it, Okay, I'm going to leave this theory of the modeling and all of that aside. If you want to ask more about it later, I'd be happy to say a few things more about it. There is one interesting implication to this, though, and that's a theme that comes up again and again throughout the Ayodhyakandam. They're having these discussions. One of the fascinating things is that Rama, they're constantly tempting him. They say to him, various people say to him, Vasishta is one of them, only one of several. Bharata comes to him and he says to him, Bharata says, I don't want to be king, I don't want any of this. Just come back, forget the whole thing, I myself would have killed my mother, if I knew she was going to do this. This is Bharata says, just come back, So Rama says, in each of these cases, he always says, if I were to follow your advice, I would be retroactively making a liar out of my father. I think that's a profound statement. It fits this world, of this linguistic world we're talking about. That's a really fascinating thing. The word is there, the word has been spoken, the Father has said it, came out of him, it expresses him, he made it out of himself in some way, right? And now all of that is going to be ruined if somebody else who's connected is going to actually somehow abrogate this thing. You can retroactively make somebody into a liar. Rama's not prepared to do that. So we can translate this into terms that are very familiar to us. It's easy to say in our modern terms. Well, father has to stay true to his word, and there's the patriarchal aspect. There's lots of things one can say, but the basic heart of the matter seems to be something that's impregnated into that kind of speech. Right? And that's an important thing in its own right. Now, there's another thing I'm just going to say. I'm going to throw it out and not elaborate on it here. I actually think what this means, this is one result of the fact that that futureness is built into the language. What it actually means is that if you speak in that kind of way, what you're really doing is you're making something true into something real. These two things are not in any sense identical. Even if you use the same word for true and real. In fact, it's a kind of diagnostic feature of this kind of linguistic culture that there is an inherent distinction between what is true and what is real. So part of Rama's task, you could say, is that he has to make this true statement. Again, make it. I'm emphasizing the fact he has to make it. He has to make it real. Okay, I'm not going to say any more about that now. I'm going to read you just 2 or 3 verses from slightly later plays. 1 second. Just so you hear the language, I'm not going to comment on them by now. I don't think you need any comment by me. Just want you to hear what Bharata says when he meets Rama in the wilderness. Remember, Bharata comes with this huge army out and meets Rama, and he begs him to come back, right? So they embrace, it's a very moving moment in Kamban. Kamban, as you can sort of already see, is a great master of the kind of emotional complexity in a moment. So he embraces his brother, and he sighs, Rama. Rama sighed. Home to all that is right, his heart soft as water, his breast wet with tears, he held his brother, as when mercy takes hold of justice. He held him without moving. He looked at the guise he was wearing. He came as an ascetic, Bharata, right? He looked at the guise he was wearing, thought hard, and said, Brother, you've suffered greatly. Is our Lord strong and well? He means the Father. His mighty arms grasping his sword. Rama doesn't know that Dasharatha is dead. Now listen to what Bharata says. Bharata says, Brother, he became ill far from you, and the black woman who bore me got her wish, which was death. He stayed true to his truth. He's in heaven. It's said in a very particular, very moving way in the Tamil. He's in heaven. That's how he tells his brother, Rama, that the father is dead. But first he says, Tanakuriya me niruvi poyumbaran. He has stayed true to his own truth. So Rama hears this. He's in heaven. The awful words pierced his ears like a spear twisting in an open wound. Like a kite, his eyes whirled, his mind whirled, and he, higher than the highest heaven, crashed to the ground. He couldn't breathe. He lost awareness, like a snake paralyzed by thunder. When he came to, he sighed, gasping inside as he burst into lament. So just one more verse. He says, this is Rama, undying light, Father to all on earth, the one and only mother to what is right, you who are compassion itself, and my own Father, lion to our enemies, have you really died? Who, alas, is left alive to be true to truth? Okay? So I don't think you need any comment on that. I just wanted you to hear the language. Now, okay, I'm going to suggest another way of thinking about this problem, and then I'm going to stop. So we're maybe 10 minutes from the end. Is that okay? Okay. See if I can find the page, just a second. So this, we're going to come at it from a slightly different angle. I'm going to set aside the whole thing about Dasharatha and Kaikeyi and the truth. And we're going to look at this term vaimai in another passage in the Ayodhyakandam, which explicitly thematizes it. That's one of the interesting things about the Kamban Ramayana, is that if you have a problem, like some doubt or query in your mind, all you have to do is keep on reading. Eventually he'll tell you exactly what he means by it. So here's a passage where he actually uses this word vaimai in a particular way. And I think he shows you one possible direction of thinking about why, the question I asked, why it is that this kind of language has this power. Maybe I should preface to this the thought also that we're talking, and it's an obvious thing, but let me just say it, we're talking about a kind of extraordinary, sort of spooky and eerie quality of language. That's a basic thing. These are words that have entered into that kind of eerie, spooky domain. Something extraordinary has happened. Okay? So this is the passage, it's the end of the Chitrakuta Paglam, that is when Rama and Sita and Lakshmana, they're on Chitrakuta mountain. Actually, it's a magnificent chapter in which there are very elaborate natural descriptions of nature. Actually, that's important. You'll see why in a moment. It's a bit like Sangam poetry. It's like the old Tamil poetry of Aham and Puram, something like that. Very long, beautiful descriptions. And at the end of it, Lakshmana builds the Parnashala, this hut for his brother and his sister-in-law, right? He's going to sleep outside, Lakshmana, right? But he's built them this hut. You know? So actually, the very interesting description of the building of the hut, there's all kinds of kind of builder's terms and, you know, the mortar and the bricks and the rafters and the beams and all of that stuff. It's beautifully, beautifully described. At the end of it, they go into the hut. So I'm going to read you another 5 or 6 verses, okay? And just, I want you to listen carefully, okay? Because something happens at this moment. When all was ready, this is Rama, he who is like the innerness of Brahma, who fills all space, and the inner surface of the living breath that we cannot conceive, entered his home with the goddess of gold. That's Sita. You know, before I go on, let me just say, I promised you I'd say something about that inner quality of this kind of truthfulness. You'll hear in a minute the truthfulness. So here's Rama. He's like the innerness of Brahma who fills all space. He's also the inner surface of the living breath. See, the kind of speech that we're talking about here is something like that. It's an interesting thing. You know, we think outside, inside, as if they're 2 separate domains. And now it turns out that the inside actually has another inside of it. Actually, it must have an outside, then an inside, another outside, then another. It probably goes on forever like that, right? So we're talking about a kind of language which is that inner surface of the inside, the innerness of interiority. That's different than just saying it comes from inside. There's a conceptual issue. The poet says, you could speak of that space as a mind free of delusion. It's just this little hut. Or as the great Veda, or as the ocean of milk, or as heaven. Happy, he filled it with a friendly heart and a love none could imagine. Rama thought, the feet softer than flowers of this Mithila princess walked through the wilderness, and the hands of my flawless brother built this home. There's nothing those who have nothing can't do. It's a nice statement, actually. Then he looked at his brother. True, he said, your arms are strong as 2 great mountains, but when did you learn how to do this? As he said it, his eyes filled with tears. Lakshmana spent his whole life in a palace. He was never trained in building huts. Somehow he learned how to do it. It's an interesting question, right? But more important is the fact that as he said it, Rama's eyes filled with tears. Rama doesn't usually speak a lot in the Tamil Ramayana. He's mostly mute for important reasons that I can't go into here. But every once in a while he says something. So here's a moment where it's sown long ago. There's nothing to be done, thought Rama. We can't move away from what is right. Then he looked again at the suffering inside this person who had found such joy. That's Lakshmana. He's found joy in serving his brother. He looked again at the suffering inside this person who had found such joy and thought, we can't wipe away the knots of sorrow. Okay, so here's a little tiny conversation. In some ways, though, very typical of Kamban, in the sense that he's the great master of this kind of, what should I call it, this kind of overloaded, emotionally intense, complex form of speech. Look what he says. If you think about it, my dear brother, the seed of this grief was sown long ago. I mean, what does it mean? We can, of course, there are all kinds of things we can conjecture what it might mean. I don't think he's talking about some previous karma or something like that. I think he's talking about the family dynamics in this particular family and all the things that were there. And don't forget that the relationship between Lakshmana and the brother and sister-in-law is often quite complex. There's a very long, interesting section where Rama and Lakshmana almost come to blows. I don't want to. He says the seeds were sown long ago. That's, I think, an amazing statement. And Rama says, there's nothing to be done. He says, I did the right thing. That's what everybody's going to say about me. Look, we've been saying it here tonight. 2,000 years later, he did the right thing, Rama. That's what we tend to think, right? But actually Rama says, so what? So what? What's it worth when I've caused you such sorrow? I mean, we could go on with this. It's getting late. I don't want to test your patience further, but let me just say that there's something very typical of Kamban, where, and this is something classed as true speech, vaimai, where you have what is spoken, and you have the emotional overload, which is not spoken. See, this is a kind of speech, like many kinds of speech, where what is not actually uttered is at least as important, perhaps more important than what is actually uttered, and that's because of the emotional complexity that is built into this kind of thing. I have a name for this. In fact, I have a whole theory about it. I don't have time to set it out for that. I call it suffusion, from suffusing. Suffusion. It's a typical thing in Kamban that he brings you to a moment like this where everything is suffused by this very intricate, elaborate, complex emotion which cannot actually be said and is not uttered. Well, I want to be precise about that. It's not that it cannot be said. I mean, you could actually paraphrase all of this if you want. I should tell you, I don't have a lot of patience for the kind of cult of ineffability that one often hears in discourses about Indian religion. People often talk about how, silence, there are many things that cannot be said, right? Silence is the truth, not like that. I don't like it. I sort of identified with something I once heard the Dalai Lama said. They asked the Dalai Lama about ineffability, about whether things are really ineffable, cannot be uttered, cannot be said. So the Dalai Lama said, we Buddhists, we believe that truth is ineffable, but not very ineffable. And I'm with him there. And I think that that's where the Kamban, notion of truth lies too. It's not that it cannot be said, right? It's that there are things that maybe should not or are not said at critical moments, and that's because of this emotional suffusion. Now, there's more that I can say of this, but remember the problem, or the question that I asked, which is why is it that this kind of language, this kind of truth is so effective? Why is it that it changes reality? And I think one of the answers is that speech like this is driven by that unuttered silence, by the things that are not said. There's an emotional energy which is so powerful that it cannot but change the world. Or another way to say it, if you like this way of thinking about it, is that just as the world itself as a whole has these kinds of gaps and lacunae and breaks in continuity and silences and things that are not explicit, so this language too is isomorphic, totally isomorphic with that thing that is built into the way the universe works. That's what I'm calling the architectonics of this thing. So I don't think this is a complete description, but it's a way of maybe beginning to think about it. I'm going to sum up by saying to you what I have tried to say over the course of the evening, just in a few phrases. What have we learned about truth in Tamil, medieval Tamil? So here's what I would say. Truth is, first and foremost, oral, audible, and musical. It is largely non-cognitive or supra-epistemic. It is non-propositional. It is a personal, individual matter, not easily generalized. It is linked to the interior, and specifically to the inside surface of the interior. It is linked to breath and to a certain degree of aliveness. It is something that is made, not revealed or discovered. It is often riddled with expressive silence or discordant syntax. It is existentially fragile and precarious in the sense that the speaker can slip away from it. It is a human business, and as such, close to the God, and as such, it is capable of becoming real. Thank you very much.